I'm Matt Brewster, Health Commissioner at the Pike County General Health District, also a member of the Sauter Valley Piketon Area Council of Government. So thanks for everybody that could make it. There is another meeting tomorrow that will be a little different format. Will be basically the same presentation that you see tonight, along with general question and answer session. There just won't be the kind of one-on-one breakout that you'll have at the end of this, which is nice, and that's the purpose of this meeting, is for the homeowners who were sampled to be able to talk with Mike and Becky and go over their results. So if you don't have your results, that's fine. They can pull them up on the computer in a format that's a little easier for everybody to look at versus the printed out version that kind of needs pieced together. The Human Health Risk Assessment was developed by Auxier and Associates, and as a result of a 2-year-long community-wide sampling event that was performed by Solution Technologies. So this initially, the ball started back in April of 2019, so it's been a long time coming, but we do have this report, and that's what they're going to present on today. The study was funded by the Department of Energy in the form of a grant through Ohio University. This meeting is intended again for property owners directly impacted by the results to be able to ask questions, and this format will work out good, especially since there's not a big turnout, so that can be advantageous for the purpose tonight. This is being recorded. It's not live streamed, but it is being recorded for questions. And then most of the questions will probably be one-on-one since we don't have a whole lot of people here. So we'll begin with the HHRA PowerPoint presentation, have a brief general question and answer session, followed by kind of one-on-one discussion between, we'll just kind of take turns going up, and we can kind of start with those in the front, and then we can kind of work our way back as they go over your individual results. Anyone does not have the results, or they didn't come tonight, that you talk to and ask you, hey, how'd the meeting go? You can let them know that if they want to send us an email, we'll be glad to email their results, or we can mail those out. If we don't have an email, we'll start doing that early next week. So everybody who was sampled will have their results. So that's enough of me talking, so I'll turn it over to Mike and Becky, and they'll give their presentation, and then we'll proceed with questions after that.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Mollenbacher, this is Becky Collins, and we're from Auxier and Associates. And well, this has been a long time coming, and we had a little conversation up here up front. Let me explain some of the things that have delayed it. Of course, we had the pandemic, and the quarantine after that, or during that. What's the risk assessment? The risk assessment is basically an estimate of potential risks of exposure to a substance by humans. Okay? It's an estimate. Keep that in mind. And why do that? Well, the results of a risk assessment can be used to figure out where to go next. Do we need to do more sampling? Is it okay to kind of take a wait and see attitude, or should we go at this with more intensity? So, and those are decisions that the community is going to have to make, but we're going to give you information, okay? And as Matt discussed, prior to the risk assessment, the community got together with Solution and put together a sampling plan saying, what did you want? What were you looking for? For example, what were the radionuclides you were looking for? You were looking for the transuranics, uranium, americium, neptunium, isotopes of plutonium, a fission product, technetium-99, and some uranium isotopes. This was set out in the plan, so this is what we focused on. You also identified the media you wanted sampled. For example, sediment, you want to know what's going on in the streams, surface water, soil, and dust in buildings. These were the directions we were told to go down. So, sampling plan also identified an area that you wanted sampled. Basically outside the plant perimeter, but no farther than, say, 6 miles out. That was the line that was drawn. So it's a donut with the blue line and the red line being the boundaries. And you also gave us direction on how and where you wanted the samples to be collected in that area. Half of the samples were collected randomly, half were selected by the community. And then specified the laboratories that were going to be doing the analyses. All that was set up before we got on the project. Then the field activity started, and there was a pilot study, basically testing the systems that were to be put in place. The sampling routines, the analytical routines at the lab, data handling and so on. Want to test everything before he invested a lot of money and effort and go out and collecting the rest of the samples. And this is about the time that we got involved. And the committee is to be commended for bringing in the risk assessors at this point, because I've been on a lot of projects where risk assessors are brought in after all the data comes in. And it's very challenging sometimes to tell people about risk when the samples don't contain any detections because they didn't get the detection limits low enough on the front end. So that's what we did. Meanwhile, the samples were collected. Sample collection continued at this point. Background samples first, and these were collected outside the 6-mile radius of the study area. So there's no background samples in the study area. They're all outside. And they tend to be weighted in the direction where the wind doesn't go. So this is outside the prevailing winds. Went out from 6 miles to 50 miles east and west of the plant. Now, in fairness, they're limited to the roads pretty much. I mean, if people didn't hike back in, but if it was easily gotten to, they would take a sample there. So, okay. And then the study area samples were collected in October, beginning October 2020, and went through April 22. Again, fighting through the effects of the pandemic. Sampling slowed way down at the end, and the sampling efficiency dropped way off. But that's kind of the timeline that we're looking at. Meanwhile, we were doing some upfront risk assessment work, trying to figure out what the laboratory criteria had to be. Some of this was already in the sampling plan, but we ended up going in and spending time in particular on detection limits. How far down did you have to see in order to come up with meaningful risk numbers? It turns out a lot of the numbers that were specified initially were okay, but technetium was going to be a problem. The laboratory detection limits that we were working with, and we got on the project, were not going to be low enough. So we went back to the labs and said, you have to meet lower detection limits. And we had some negotiations. It didn't always go smoothly, but we got the detection limit down. So, and the reason, of course, we want it down is because we want to be able to see the concentrations at these really low levels, because sometimes the risk numbers are really sensitive to these concentrations. And so you got to see the low concentrations to make it all work. So that's one of the primary things that we did on the front end of this. So we just established the detection limits, and we did it for each of the media based on the different exposures that you were likely to come up against if you in contact with these different media. For example, soil, inhalation of resuspended dust, soil ingestion, direct exposure, and produce. Plants, gardens, and then finally the dust exposure rate inside of buildings and so on. In particular, handling things, get dust on your fingers, and inadvertently ingest some of that, and direct exposure from the dust. So those were the pathways that we were looking at, and we established our risk numbers based on that, and that's how we set up our detection limits. You had to be able to get a concentration that could see the numbers we needed to see. So all these samples went to the lab, got analyzed, came back to us. We validated the samples, looked at them. Of all the samples, I think we ended up rejecting one because the laboratory results, in particular, I think the blank on that one, there was a blank that was just, we couldn't use the sample. The laboratory had not done what they needed to do, so we rejected the sample. Everything else we kept. So let's go through this pretty quick now. You're about to see walls of numbers, which are going to be the results. And bear with me here, because we're going to go through those pretty quick. They're over there on that, on those panels if you want to go look at them in detail. I'm going to go through the first one in some detail so that you can see the format. They're all going to be laid out the same way. And then we're going to go from these concentration numbers to risk numbers. But this is the results of the sampling that you all wanted done. Sediment sampling locations, there's 20 of them, and we ended up with lots of uranium. Yep, uranium shows up in every one, but then uranium should show up in every one because it's a background radionuclide. If it didn't show up, there'd be a problem. But the ones above uranium, these 5 up here, these are all the anthropogenic, or as I learned back in the Stone Age, man-made radionuclides. This column is the number of samples, 20. This is the raw data coming out of the laboratories, the highest and the lowest numbers. And if you notice, there's some negative numbers, and that's good because that shows you that the laboratory is not putting any filters on the data. You expect some negative numbers. In a real lab, you'll get negative numbers if you've got a lot of concentrations down, either 0 or very close to background. You'll find some. So this tells you it's real data. Median is a central tendency of the distribution, kind of gives you an idea of, 50% of the samples came in above this number, 50 came in below. It's just kind of a check. And they're all pretty low. I mean, this is indicative of normal background on picocurie per uranium, for example. So it's our way of checking the data as the data goes past. Now let's look at kind of what that means. Remember I said we set the detection limits low? Okay, so we looked at the data and determined where the material was actually detected in the samples. Not just we get a result, but is it an actual detection? And when we did that, we found that there were only like 3 samples in the sediments that had any detections of any of these top 5 radionuclides. It's just, and the detections themselves were quite low. Here's the range of just detected values. They're low. These are quite low numbers. And we'll pick this up again later. Let me go through what the other media came up with, because I know that this is kind of boring stuff, but I just wanted to show you that this is what we got. Here's the locations for surface water. They're pretty much the same as sediment, as you'd expect. There's a few different ones, but they're mostly the same locations. We have the same kind of table, same format, and again, we didn't detect much in the surface water. There's not a lot to be detected out there. Soil. Now here's where most of the effort went. There's 826 samples, 820, excuse me, I don't have my glasses. 825 locations. And this doesn't look like 825 dots because many of these samples were collected basically on top of each other. They're right next to each other. You just can't see them on this map. But this is 825 locations. And most of them were surface samples. We had a few subsurface samples, and we can discuss those, particularly with the property owners who have these on their property. And again, the statistics on those show a similar trend, but not as much. Let me explain what I mean by that. Look at the number of detections. It's much lower than the number of samples for the transuranics, with the exception of plutonium. But look at these two. You've got the fission product, technetium-99, and plutonium-239. One sample in 3, we could see that. There's something in one sample in 3 that we collected. And again, the numbers for most of them are not super high, but they're definitely above background. Kinds of background numbers that we're used to seeing. So, this is kind of the meat of the survey, of these soil samples, and we'll come back to them. But I wanted you to see that, we took a lot of soil samples in this area. Dust samples, 14 locations, 14 buildings. 8 of them were schools. We sampled multiple locations in each building. And the numbers there, again, were not particularly remarkable. But now these are concentrations. What does that mean? I mean, what do these numbers mean when we come to risk? Well, let's take a minute and talk about risk just a little bit. We are surrounded by radiation. We live in a sea of radiation. That's just natural. That comes from it comes from the ground. It comes from radon in the air. Extraterrestrial. We are surrounded by radiation. So there's a certain amount of risk involved. Now, what you're interested in is the additional risks, stuff that's not natural. Okay? And risk assessors have their own jargon. Does that surprise anyone? We call it incremental risk. Okay. Now, it can be a lot of risk, or it can be a little risk. And so what we're going to try and do here is kind of put this in context. These risk numbers we're going to throw at you, we're going to try to put it in context. So, I'm a very visual one, and so something like this helps me, and I figured there's a few people in the audience that this might help too. Think of it as a thermometer, only you've got risks. Risks, the higher risk is at the top, red, and the lower risks are at the bottom, blue. Cancer risks, 1 in 3 people are going to get cancer. Whether there's 1 in 3 people in this room, 1 in 3 people in a room in Texas, or a room in Washington State, 1 in 3 people are going to get risk. That's just the way it works out. 1 in 5 people are going to die from cancer. Again, that's just the way it works out. And these are real numbers to me because both my grandfather and my father got cancer and died from it. So it's in my family. I mean, this is personal. So I get this. So just sort of keep that in mind. Now, if you look a little bit further down, some other risks you might encounter, and we're going to skip the smoker. Everybody picks on smokers. Let's go to radon. Radon in a house. You are going to be exposed to radon in most homes. And commonly, it's going to range between probably, in extreme cases, maybe 1 in 100 risk of cancer from radon. It's down maybe 1 in 1,000. It just depends on the level of radon in your home. Again, this is just common everyday stuff. People don't think about it, but we all live with this. And if you look, we're going a little bit further, you'll see this green area. Those of you who are colorblind, I apologize, this is green. EPA's acceptable risk range is highlighted here. Now, what do we mean by acceptable risk? EPA has been, one of the tasks EPA has been given is to identify and clean up toxic waste sites in the U.S. There's not an unlimited amount of money for that, so they have to prioritize that cleanup operation. Now, EPA uses 9 criteria to rank these sites, the national priority list. That's the ranking of sites in this country. 3 of those criteria are risk-based. And so EPA developed a methodology of assessing risk for their use. And so when the EPA says it's acceptable risk, it's acceptable within the context of their ranking system. Now, since its development in the early 90s, other people have co-opted this, and this acceptable term has sort of seen some mission creep. That its original purpose was to rank sites, okay? So all their models are based on that. And let's talk about these endpoints just a little bit more before we get into reporting what your risks are. EPA's point of departure is 10 to the minus 6, bottom of that scale. And what is meant by that is it's a regulatory limit. Below that, they don't think it's worth federal regard. They don't necessarily take it off the board, but they aren't going to invest a lot of resources in it. They're kind of taking a wait and see, or if it's below 10 to the minus 6, they'll take a wait and see attitude. Above 10 to the minus 6, they, depending on the amount of sampling that's been done, they tend to say, well, let's take that as a point of departure, a starting point, and maybe let's get some investigations going. Let's learn more about this site. It's over 10 to the minus 6, okay? That's where that 10 to the minus 6 number comes in. 10 to the minus 4 number is what they call their upper bound of the acceptable risk. Above this, EPA starts focusing pretty hard on the site. So that's kind of, if it's a surplus site, they bump it up the priorities list. And at which point, many different things can happen. But the site kind of gets promoted at that point. If it's below that but above 6, again, it's do we need to get more samples? Can we wait and see on this one and take care of more hazardous sites? You see the point of the risk gradient there. It's not a what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to use a big word like discriminator, like a trigger. You've got a range, and your reaction to the risks is going to be regulated by where it is in that range. Okay. Now, what we use these for, the 10 to the minus 4 number, is investigative levels. And we'll get into these a little bit more when we start talking about the individual sample points. But to us, the 10 to the minus 4 risk is a investigative level. So, one more thing about the risk. The way EPA handles risk, it's risk to a population from an area. So their calculations, they're going to assume that a large area has one concentration. It's uniform across there. It's just the way their models are set up. So let's talk about the risks that we saw here. We're through all the introductory stuff now. Let's talk about the risks. Sediment pathways, the risks are quite small. You see 10 to the minus 8. And that's in the study area. And when you compare it to similar samples taken outside study area, it's also a small risk. Now, if you look at this number and that number, it looks like background risks are higher. This is just an artifact of the samples. We've pushed these sampling technologies so far that I'm going to say that these are actually the same number. This is just random variation in the results. There's not a lot out there. Same thing with surface water. The numbers are quite low, 10 to the minus 9. At that point, we didn't focus much more on those two media. Next, we looked at soil, and we did some analyses on all the samples that came through. We did evaluations, various statistical tests, and so on. And we ran them through EPA's risk calculators, and we got some interesting numbers. Background numbers are coming in about 10 to the minus 6. 10 to the minus 6. And your study numbers, 7 times 10 to the minus 4 rounds up to 10 to the minus 6. I mean, this is within the variation that you expected numbers in this range. This is the same number for all analytes. If you don't have a garden, your risks from soil are essentially indistinguishable from background. And here's some breakdowns for it. You can see how some of the individual radionuclides, how much they contribute to the total risk and so on. But again, these numbers are fairly low. Again, it's using risk models developed by EPA. So, with dust, we calculated risks inside buildings of 10 to the minus 7. And there's not a whole lot of risk out here. It's very small. But that's for the general population. But as was pointed out to us, and as we were aware going into this, there are people out there whose behaviors put them at more risk, or perhaps their genetic predisposition puts them at more risk, or their locations put them at more risk. So we started to look at critical subpopulations within the larger population. And we started out by asking you all, what kinds of behaviors, what are your lives like? What do you do? And so from that, we were able to identify some things that might raise exposures, like local gardening, local fishing. We had somebody that claimed that I guess, was it they claimed it, or they had a neighbor that claimed it?
They said they knew people.
They knew people who had lived here their whole life. Okay, so that's 70-year or so exposure, as opposed to the 26-year exposure that EPA normally uses. So it includes longer-term residents, and then of course school children, because that was a focus of the original inquiry. So we ended up running all that through the models, and so basically we have these results. The resident, that's basically everybody who isn't in one of these subpopulations. Again, you're in 10 to the minus 6 range, and these are essentially the same numbers. So 10 to the minus 6, but indistinguishable from background. If you aren't in one of the subpopulations, it's probably, you can probably sleep pretty easy at night. Resident with a garden. Now here we start getting into numbers that are creeping up, 10 to the minus 5. We're getting up close to that 10 to the minus 4 number. But I would ask you to compare the background and the study area numbers. Study areas are slightly above that, and if you were to subtract background from study area, you're only looking at somewhere around 1.5, 2 times 10 to the minus 2. Again, that's not a big number from EPA's viewpoint. Fish, we only had 2 samples or 3 samples? 2 samples on fish that came up. But if you were to eat a lot of fish at those concentrations, now you're looking at 3 to 4 times 10 to the minus 5 risk. So again, you're up in the minus 5 risks. But if you subtract background, again, a lot of it goes away. Long-term resident is about, let's see, it's about twice, 2.5 times what a resident is, and that's what you'd expect, because the only change between this subpopulation and the resident is this is 26 years, and this is 70 years. 70 years. So that's going to be a change, so of course your exposure would go up that much. Finally, in school attendance, we went to the school calendar and figured out how many hours students were expected to be in school for a year, and times the number of years they would be in school. and this is the lifetime risk that we got for them. Again, those are pretty low numbers. So it would seem that in these critical subpopulations we looked at, while there is some projected risk, it's not a lot of the risk in the greater scheme of things. So, come to the last one. Save your questions until the end, please, and we'll get them all at once, okay? Now we come to the last group. It's where does a person live? Does that matter? Well, to get at that, this is not quite as easy as it might appear. To get at that, what we did was we took the models we were using and we figured out what concentration in the soil equals 10 to the minus 4 risk, 10 to the minus 6 risk for the various scenarios. And for particularly for the garden, I thought was very interesting. Without a garden, you can have thousands of picocuries from technetium-99, and it's not a big deal. And that makes sense because this is what they give you when you do cardiac investigations. They want to see inside your heart. They give you Tech-99 because they can see it in their image scopes. However, when you mix plants in with this, we found that EPA assumed that the plant uptake, the soil plant uptake number, was 180. Basically, EPA assumes that if you got 1 picocurie of Tech-99 in the soil, you got 180 picocuries in vegetables. It's the highest one in their system. I invite you to Google that. Go look it up. Don't take my word for it. Look it up. It's very high. So high that I was surprised. I thought maybe somebody left a decimal point out of their number. But it's EPA's number, so we used it. Anyways, this number then was the number that we screened all the data for, the soil data. And any analyte with concentrations that exceeded the investigative level, we flattened. It turned out only technetium did that. And while technetium was detected in about a third of the samples, technetium exceeded our target, our investigative level in 83 samples from 73 locations. So it turns out it does matter pretty good. But I'm going to caveat that because this is dependent on EPA's models, and I just told you that EPA's models are extremely dependent on a single number. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So when you plot it on the map, you get this. Let me explain what these are. Let's go to the red ones first. That's the numbers that are greater than 10 to the minus 4 risk. It means that that sample contains a concentration that when plugged into EPA's calculators would exceed 10 to the minus 4 risk. It does not mean people at that location are going to get that risk though. I want to come back to that. The yellow ones are, it's above the point of departure, but it's below the 10 to the minus 4 risk. Now the other samples where they were detected, but detected below 10 to the minus 6, we didn't plot because we didn't want to clutter up the figure. We wanted to leave it as clear as we could get. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. That's kind of where we are. Now, why did I say just because you've got a dot sitting here, people near that are not going to be 10 to the minus 6 risk? Because remember when I said the EPA considers the whole homestead basically a large area to you get your risk from, particularly plants. You got to have an area big enough for a garden. And in this case, your garden needs to be about 0.7 acres per person to generate enough vegetables to create that 10 to the minus 4 risk. It's a pretty big garden. I don't know how many people in the area have got that. I'm not saying they don't, but it's something to consider. That's 0.7 acres per person. So if you're a family of 4, that's almost 3 acres of garden. if it's just that single point, instead of having a big big area, if you just got a point, see, that's where this is EPA's vision. This is what the models are based on. If you just have the one point, though, I'll get there eventually. There it is. This guy. See, we don't know anything about the rest of this area. You would need to go out and sample this and determine that is indeed the concentration across this whole area. And in fact, there's some doubt that it would be. We're getting this some more information that we gathered up. And there's a lot of information here, and it's all interwoven. So bear with me a little bit longer. So basically, we focused on technetium. We came up with technetium as the most important rating group line in the study. And you've got, this is all the samples now. This is the white ones are the non-detects. The black ones are detected below 10 to the -6. This color here, green. Green is within EPA's acceptable range, green dot for the green range. And then the yellow up here, this is where the risks exceed 10 to the -4. So you can have a look. And if you look at it closely, you'll see that a lot of these areas have got dots clustered together that are different colors, which means it's not uniform, it's not spread out, it's splotchy. It's unevenly distributed across the study area. And I stared at this for, well, over a period of days, many hours, trying to figure out what was going on. Because I expected to see, in the prevailing winds, you would see a plume. That's what I was looking for. I didn't see it. It's not there. So I don't know how it got distributed. Maybe fog in the morning, maybe rainouts, differential rainouts. I don't know how it got so mixed up like this, but it's not evenly distributed across the study area. Let's come back to the soil to plant uptake. This might all be a moot point, because if EPA's got this wrong, if they're severely overestimating the technetium uptake by plants, then this model is wrong. It's overestimating the risk. It's exaggerating what you would expect. And there's some reason to believe that this should be looked at. We looked at EPA's primary source documents. We went back and did some digging. There are several studies on technetium, some of them from the 80s, some of them from the early 90s, and one from, is it 99 or early thousands? This the single one that has the EPA's mandate is to protect the public, protect you. So they go, and if they don't know answer to a question, they're going to guess high. They're going to always guess towards the health protective, higher risk. So they have one sample, one study in their library. It was higher than all the rest. So they based their number on that sample. And if you look at the other samples, the other surveys, other papers, their numbers are lower. And I don't know who's right. But I think it would be a very good idea to really take a hard look at this number before we go too far with this one. This is an unknown that has some serious effects on these results we presented to you. Small changes in this number make a huge variation in projected risks. So it's important to nail this one down. And I've already told you, it's based primarily on one study. So just keep that in mind. In general, calculated risk to residents in the study area are around 1 in a million. It's about equivalent to being struck by lightning. The potential subpopulations, what we found was that residents eating more than 300 pounds of local leafy produce per year, you end up with a risk of about 6 times 10 to the minus 5, which again is below EPA's 10 to the minus 4 risk. But it is definitely about 10 to the minus 6. And for fish, same thing. We've got some risks in the 10 to the minus 5 range now. It's 29 pounds of fish flesh. And remember, we just have 2 samples of the water that these fish are supposedly swimming in. And I wonder what the carrying capacity of that stream is. Can somebody really eat 29 pounds of fish flesh? Not fish, fish flesh from that stream. But present it because it's a potential risk. The other subpopulations, the risks are quite small, they're well under 10 to the minus 6. So that's kind of where we ended up with the risk numbers. And again, I would stress that I think we ought to go take a look at local produce. Let's go out and get some samples from people's gardens. You have anybody that's got raises, crops for market? Let's see if we can get some samples of the plants, and let's get samples of the soil too, so we can come up with a site-specific soil transfer factor. It might be lower, it might be higher. I don't know, but I think because the models are so sensitive to that parameter, I think you might want to know that before you go further with it. Sample fish in the surface water. Again, I'm not sure that the carrying capacity is there, but to be complete, let's get some fish samples. And we'd like to do some additional sampling inside the Zach Corner Middle School. There were some scheduling difficulties with getting a full set of samples from inside there, and I think we ought to tie that off. Finish that up, get some more samples inside there. And if you decide to demo the place, make this survey sufficient to stand as a closeout survey. If it's contaminated, then you want to treat it like that. You want to make sure it goes in the right disposal facility. If it's not contaminated, save some money, you put it in a landfill, sleep well at night. And so that's pretty much it. I guess we open it up for questions at this point.
I'm gonna pass the remote around so everybody can hear me. Sorry. Well, we'll do the remote.
Thank you.
Big Brother wants to record it.
Appreciate your presentation. I'm with the Community Action Committee of Pike County, and we're just down the road, and we run multiple Head Start daycare sites, so we do have a concern about the impact potentially on children, since sometimes substances, and I'm not a scientist, full disclosure, sometimes those kinds of substances can have a different impact on children's health as they're developing in their bones and things similar to lead. So I was wondering if you could address that. And then in regards to the chart that you had about the subsets of the population, most of the folks in our community garden and eat food from their garden and have kids that go to school and eat fish here, and the average consumption of fish annually is like 89 pounds a year, I guess, if you're being a healthy person. So when you add all of those things together, my question and concern is, then what is the risk factor? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's a lot of new information to digest. That's a lot of fish. And you're saying most people in the county most people have gardens? Because we sent out a questionnaire, and that's not what we got back from the community. We put it in as a subpopulation so that you could see it, and if you think we're wrong, of course, now you've got the information to move forward. It doesn't change the risk on those subpopulation numbers.
So when you add all those together, it doesn't increase the risk factor?
But you can't really, because you'd be double counting a lot of pathways. you're gonna have to add, you're saying that the garden and fish are gonna be the same, you're gonna have to find, put the fish pathway in with the garden. But remember, it's probably going to be a pretty small number. I mean, you can game the system, come up with greater than 10 times 4. I mean, it's easy to do.
They are not in attendance.
Okay. Yeah. So I can't speak to anything other than the radiologicals, but from what I see here, I wouldn't be particularly worried about the radiological components. Now, if you've got other stuff in mind, plus I've suggested a few additional routes of inquiry where you get the most bang for your buck for the risk. For example, figuring out exactly what the produce intake, how many doses and risk do that really bring into the community? That would be where I would look. That'd be the first place I would look if I was still concerned that this was a problem. Yeah.
To let you know, these questions are being recorded too, so we can look into those more as well. So they're being recorded, and if you want to, if you got a general question, just raise your hand. I'll bring the mic around to you, and then once we get through those, we can break out to the kind of the individual results.
So my question is, even though the subpopulation where they have slightly like an increased risk, but it doesn't really meet that EPA threshold of the 10 to the -4. So if you're in that kind of midsection, is there a risk still involved there, even though it doesn't meet that EPA definition of a risk? Does that make sense?
Yeah, in theory. Now, you can't apply these models to an individual. That's just, you can't do that. But I mean, people do it, but you're not supposed to.
I don't need the mic, I don't think.
I'll let Colley.
Okay. I am one of the teachers that I worked at Zons Corner Middle School. So have they tested the
Of the report. So you'll find it, the report from Solution to the committee. Was it to the committee or to the health department?
We've posted it before. We can post it again.
Yeah, well, no, it's in the report too. I
Yeah,
just
it's in the
want to
report.
make sure the bona fides are right. Who it went from to.
I'm not finished.
But it's there. It's in the report.
if they find that it's safe, could we go back into that school?
Well, in theory, but you've had the air conditioning turned off for how many years now? I got to believe that there's mold all through that thing at this point.
So instead of being shut down for radiation, we're going to be shut down for mold.
Well, I'm no expert on mold, but
I'm just saying.
I have surveyed a lot of buildings that have been taken out of commission for years, and that's a problem.
So the electricity is still on, and our administration tells us that the electric is still on there.
Mm-hmm.
And I live right beside
Is
of it.
the air conditioning still on?
I don't know. So that's a question I need to ask, right?
Oh, I thought it was basically shut down and walked away because during the heat of the summer they couldn't go in.
I walked out of there. We have 20-year teachers that have just left their stuff. We're not allowed to go back in and get anything. I have degrees hanging on the wall. I had to pay $75 a piece just to get a copy of each degree. So I'm just saying, I'm not poking the bear to you. I'm just saying, who is responsible for that decision to say, hey, you're never going back to that school again?
Yeah, I have no first-hand knowledge about that.
Okay.
I cannot answer it.
So do we have any kind of results that we can make public to the?
Well, yeah, the stuff that that solution came up with.
Okay.
So that's all in the back of the report. There's hundreds.
And so did you say that was incomplete study though?
Yeah, we went back and for these other buildings, we went back with a systematic approach to take smears on various surfaces, different types. We never went in to take the comparable part of the survey in Sons Middle School because there were some scheduling issues. The field crew was there, ready to go, and the scheduling just did not work out.
So the people that came to test were actually there?
Yes.
And didn't get to test?
I'm going to let Matt.
I can address some of those things too. So you can finish with whatever you want to ask.
Okay, so that's all I want to know because,
Yeah.
we were just kind of ousted out there and just kind of left in the.
All I know is we never got smears from
Okay.
Sons. Yeah.
So you
But
never
we got other information.
Okay.
We got information from Sons we didn't get from the other schools.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you said that you didn't get to complete samples of them.
Well, yeah, not
How
really.
did we show school now without complete samples and have 1,000 kids crammed in the building over here with sewer running on the floor?
Well, based on the information I saw on the materials that were screened out of there wasn't anything in it.
That's
Yeah,
my question.
yeah. And please go to the report, open up in the back of one of the attachments, you'll see the data. I went through it, I tried to put it in a presentable format so people could see and understand.
So where's that
what was
report at
done.
again?
It'll be made public after this. It's not really my place to talk a lot about Zons Corner necessarily, but a little background is the decision was the school board. There's been 2 different sampling events at Zons Corner, not including the and what Mike's referring to is solutions. They looked at computers, books, things that you wouldn't expect to find issues with. They didn't look at air ducts, ventilation system, things that haven't been touched for years. So, but again, the Department of Energy did a sampling event there, Memorial Day of 2019. We took split samples at that same time. Those have been made publicized and have been public since 2019. We can resend those. Both reports have been public. DOE has posted, along with the COG and the Health Department, put those samples, the split samples that we had that showed things above background, and then you had DOE that did their own sampling. So that's all public record. It's been available for 4 years and has been posted multiple times. But again, you can talk to the school about some of those things, but the things to save from Zons Corner were easy access, computers, things that you wouldn't expect to find. And like I said, you can talk to administration and the school board about those things specifically. But there has been 2 sampling events, have been publicized, and I'll be happy to email those once we round them up. Again, they're readily available and can be sent to whoever wants to see those results.
Those results, I have another question. I'm not, I don't know what justifies shutting down a school. But when I look at those results, I'm just looking at it, I just feel lost. Was it enough to shut down the school, what you found? Since 2019, our school board will tell us nothing. They table every time.
The school board looked at, basically, they didn't want to put any unforeseen risk on students. So there was things found originally by Dr. Ketter with his study that was part of the original that led to the independent assessment, which led to all these things. So there was things that Dr. Ketter found that was the first sampling event inside the school. They looked at things that were the air ducts, and like I said, we can send you that and it'll show you the results that their report wasn't as much as concentration up, but was things that were proven from the plant found there. So just like Mike said, anything above background, regardless of what that amount is, does increase risk, no matter how small that is. So that was the concern, that you have students going to a building that you know there are radioactive isotopes there that are known cancer causers. The other thing that happened at the same time was the neptunium level that was found. So despite Dr. Ketter's initial sampling, the other issue was the neptunium, that kind of the understanding there, and our conclusion is that it was disturbed during the excavation for the on-site disposal cell. You have Neptunium-237 documented on the property, and then you excavated 300 acres in 2017, and that's what was detected at the school air monitor. So regardless of what the decision with Dr. Ketter's samples of things there or not, the issue of the air monitor hit, which was DOE's own data, that was the other issue at the same time. So there was enough there to raise a red flag and said, hey, and that's what the school went off of there. And that was their thinking was the twofold risk. Ketter, in addition to DOE's own sampling, and that's in the ACER report that's available. That's a 2018 ACER report, but the data was October of 2017, which was the same time as the excavation for the on-site disposal cell.
Okay.
And was that all parts of yours? I was going to say one other thing that you had asked, but I'm trying to remember what it was. If I think of it, I'll chime in. Other questions?
I have one, Matt. When we talk about the background numbers here, are the people in the test area, are the numbers here on background any different than we might find anywhere else in the state of Ohio?
Let's start with uranium. No. What you find in background for uranium, no. Some of the other numbers, it's difficult to answer your question because we push the detection limits way down on some of these. Most of the background surveys that you will find in the literature basically say undetected. Doesn't say what the background level is, it just says we couldn't see it. We can actually see it in some of our samples. So I can't really answer your question except to say that it's really low.
So are there published numbers out there like Madison County, Franklin County? Are there numbers out there that have published background radiation where we can compare it?
There are numbers out there. I don't know about countywide.
Yeah.
It's not something people do unless they have a reason to go out and test this stuff. And then
right.
you normally test for what you're interested in.
Right.
If you're a facility that handles radium, for example, you go out and you'll just look for radium. You won't look for the rest of the stuff.
Well,
So the information's scattered. It's really not all in one place. Probably the biggest and most concise background study in the past 30 years was the one that was done for Fernald. They did background soil and water and stuff. But even then, I don't think the background numbers, the detection numbers were pushed down far enough. So I'm not even sure you can use that one.
Well, when you look down the side of the River Valley, it's highly industrialized from Columbus south. We've got everything from paper manufacturing, truck manufacturing. They make toilet paper in Pickaway County. They make products up there for solar panels, DuPont. And the question is, are the numbers here different than those industrialized areas?
You'd have to show me the data because I haven't seen any.
This is our thing. We enrich nuclear energy here, nuclear uranium. So, are we put at a higher risk for doing that?
I don't have enough information to answer your question.
Okay. Well, that's what I need to be able to tell people because
Yeah.
I'm a county commissioner, and when people come up and ask me, is it more dangerous for us to live here? I need an answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I appreciate that. I do. It's radiation. They almost always forget to go measure background. Yeah. And as a result, when somebody like you says, well, what is background?
Yeah.
And I stand up here like a deer in the headlights.
Well, you know, it's a question that needs to be answered because that puts people's mind at ease. If they know there's no more background here than there is anywhere else in the industrialized areas.
You know, you would get a lot of support from the academic community and from scientists. Let's find out what background is. Yes.
Okay.
But who's going to pay for it? That's the question. I would love to see that. We got one up front.
Could you tell me with the water samples you took, are you using the EPA 900 method? Is that how you're calculating for the exposures? I mean, the water samples that you took. Are you going by the EPA's 900 series method?
For which radionuclide? Different things were done to see different radionuclides. One method can't see them all.
Are you getting enough water samples to do this with?
Oh yeah, like 4 liters a sample, I think, something like that. We'd have to double check with solution to make sure, but that's pretty typical. You collect 4 liters for a water sample.
Now, we have another air monitor. These are air monitors that picked up the neptunium and the americia in the school. We have another one 14 miles from this plant over in Otway. And nobody's addressing that now since Anna White got fired because she wanted to try to help what was going on here. And everyone just turned their back after Anna White got fired. And no one's paying any attention about the air miles in Otway. And there's a school there in that valley, which is called Northwest High School. And that air monitor is setting in the same path as this school. Now, I don't believe they shut the school down over here unless they found neptunium and americia. I was a worker at the plant, and the company tested me for neptunium. And I have neptunium in my lungs, so I'm very concerned about the neptunium and the americia that swept that site. And I wonder what you think about the Moody report, which was a forensic report in the pathology going into all of these neptunium and plutonium and americia, technetium 99, which is water soluble and it's widespread at the plant. And it's off-site because I went to the EPA office in Logan probably 15 years ago, and this water in Little Beaver Creek and Big Beaver Creek was contaminated, and it's still contaminated today. And that empties out into the Scioto River, into the Ohio River. We have a huge problem here at this site. The contamination has gone off-site now for almost 70 years, and I have a document stating that from 55 until the 80s, transuranics was at this site. We recycled reactor fuel from West Valley, New York, Savannah River, Hanford, and then in 92, we got the Russian stuff here, and all this stuff had transuranics in it, plutonium, neptunium, and americia. We have strontium, you name it, we have it here at this site. We have a huge problem, probably the worst problem in the United States of any facility. This is the worst. We have the highest cancer rate in this county, and try to downplay saying we got background radiation is a bunch of bull.
Thanks, Mike. Not sure what question you can address there. I mean, they're limited to the human health risk things, but Mike, you can respond to whatever part of that you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, we based our conclusions based on the samples that were selected for the sampling analysis plan developed by the community. I don't know that it addressed what you're talking about. I do know that we deliberately did not look at any DOE publications. We did not want to be tainted by what DOE said. So if you ask us any questions based on DOE stuff, DOE samplers, DOE environmental reports, I can't answer
Who's funding you? Who's
Vina,
funding?
they were funded, the Department of Energy funded, as I said at the beginning, through a grant through High University. That was when the COG and the health department petitioned after the initial off-site contamination in the school and the air hit at Zohn's Corner. There's a group of us went to Washington and we said, hey, we need this looked at, and as you mentioned, Ann White was the one that approved that before whatever happened, but anyways, that's how that started. So the health department basically managed the grant, and you know, we've dealt with this for over 4 years, and we did everything possible to eliminate any bias. DOE did not review any of this stuff beforehand, still hasn't seen some of the stuff, so we did everything possible with the solution as the contractor, Auxier, all of every entity involved. We did everything we could to avoid the perception that DOE has any impact on any of this stuff other than being the funder, and they did fund that, and that's public knowledge, but that was the only role they had, and that was through High University. Other questions?
What are the next steps in terms of your recommendations to the Department of Energy for the community?
I guess I'm asking you.
We've got if you want to, instead of me reading that whole sheet, that's kind of our next steps. And Mike mentioned some of those, and I know there's been talk about, this was all about RAD, and the initial independent assessment, we wanted to look at chemicals as well, which if you ask a lot of locals, and we're kind of on Vina handle that, and some others, that TCE and PCBs, especially TCE, is probably more concerning than a lot of other RAD things. So again, that wasn't included in this study, but it would be very nice to have those results. But one sheet there that kind of gives next steps, and Mike's about some of their recommendations, which is to look at plant uptake, fish, and then maybe some increased sampling on some of these places that have, that exceed those levels of concern. Any other questions? Okay, the remaining part, we're here till 7. So Mike and Becky, again, if you have your results, they've got everyone's results that are here. They can pull those up on a laptop and kind of one-on-one answer those questions. So we can start with the Pettits there in the front. We'll let them go first, and kind of as they're finished, the next group can kind of go down there, and we'll all kind of keep an eye on the clock, and we'll make sure everybody has a chance to ask questions, kind of that one-on-one setting with their individual results, because that's really the purpose of the season. So other than that, I'll kind of let that play out. Mike, if you got any comments or things there, you can go ahead.
No, I just want to say thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
What's the talk to you all? That don't sound good. That
No, it's
scares
just
the hell out of me.
No.
Oh, what did we look? Should have called me. Seriously.
Well, we have certain contraction things. Now we're around the part where we've eliminated a lot of noise. Eliminated a lot of noise. Now,
His writing stinks.
I'm left-handed.
He's left-handed and he's got the left-handed.
now we get to concentrate on the things that are
Let me start out by saying that I lost my language. My daughter also passed away, but she also had a thyroid cancer. My father passed away with liver cancer.
Oh, from the NIOSH study? I'm sorry. Very close call.
All these years, all this